All right. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp. And today, Happy Hour is super happy because you get not one, but two theologians who liked each other so much they decided to write a book together, Grace and Susan. So thank you for joining Happy Hour.
Thanks for having us, Tripp. It's good to see you again.
Yeah,
Oh,
thanks
yeah.
so much, Tripp, for having me, and it's great to do it with Susan. Yeah, we like each other that much that we wrote a book together, and we're still friends after writing the book together.
That's right.
Many people become enemies, but we're still good friends. So this is wonderful. So thanks, Tripp, for having us, and thank you to all the listeners right now.
All right. Well, we have a whole bunch of fun questions that people send in. If you're on the Zoom or in the Facebook group and you have questions, you can send them, and I'll try to add them into the order that I think I have structured, because I knew it needed to be more structured since there are three of us, and no one enjoys watching people decide who's going to talk on Zoom. Everyone's already maxed out about that. No one wants that at Happy Hour. So the first question was, how do two people that are Christian theologians, and I can't tell if they asked this being sarcastic or not, like because they're worried about intersectional, but how do two Christians who are professional theologians decide to connect theology and intersectional analysis? And so I wonder, maybe you could both share a bit about yourself for people that aren't familiar with you, and then how you as an individual scholar started to connect with the different theorists that I guess are getting clumped in intersectional analysis.
Well, I would say I'm not a professional theologian. I just play one on Zoom, I guess.
No, you're a great theologian.
My background was in religious education, but of course I was at a Baptist seminary, so we had to do a lot of biblical studies and theology. But I made the jump, almost 25 years ago, from teaching religion to teaching women, gender, and sexuality studies, for whom intersectionality is not a new concept. It's been part of our vocabulary as long as I've been in the discipline. But that's how I kind of ended up in this spot where I bring those two worlds together. And that's how I met Grace, because I was teaching a feminist theology class using her book, and a colleague of mine, Robert Thompson, said, "Oh, well, I know Grace. Should we bring her out here to speak?" And I said, "Let's do it." And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah. So, my degree is in theology. Actually, Susan's degree is in theology too. It's just she made the leap over to the, I guess, I don't know if it's the darker side or the brighter side, whatever side. Anyway, she made the leap, and I just stayed in theology. And, looking through all my work, Tripp, I think about 2016, I had an interview at Duke Divinity, and the man that was interviewing me for the magazine at Duke Divinity said, Grace, you're all over the place. You talk about Holy Spirit, you talk about climate change and gender justice and racial justice, etc. And I said, these things are all important and everybody should be talking about them. And then I realized that this is what intersectionality is. And we need to talk about it as theologians. And I think I picked the best partner to talk about it, the best person to write, because Susan actually, she's a prolific writer. She writes things as I'm just trying to get out of bed, She writes things so quickly and so clearly, and I'm just like mulling it through, and I think that's exactly what I wanted to write, Susan. Thank you for writing that part. But I think all roads, I said this to my daughter because she's doing something on intersectionality. She's a freshman at Cornell, and I don't even know what course she's in, some science course, but she's asking me a few weeks ago about intersectionality. And I told her, all roads lead to intersectionality. And, I said this before, and Susan and I laugh, but I'm writing other stuff these days, and everything I've written in the last couple years since our book came out, I just keep referring to the book. I'm like, all things lead to intersectionality. So whatever you're working on, theology, religious studies, women's studies, those who are doing climate justice, those who are doing eco-theology, I think you'll realize that everything is intersectional, and we need to talk about it. We need to understand it so that we can kind of work presently and go forward.
So, how would you? I'll let Susan answer first. How would you uh, explain intersectional analysis? Like when people show up in your class, it's the fruit of a number of different types of kind of critical theory and stuff. So maybe you can talk about the way they build and culminate to a particular type of analysis from multiple positions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, intersectionality as a concept um, really comes through Black feminist thought. And Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, but it was part of Black feminist thought long before that, going all the way back to people like Sojourner Truth, who really used those notions in her own speaking. And intersectionality is, and I'm glad you talked about intersectional analysis, because it really is a tool for analysis. It's a way for us to look at things that are going on and examine how gender, race, class, sexuality are not only all operative at the same time, but are shaping one another. I always tell my students, it's sort of like recognizing if you mix red paint and blue paint and you get purple paint, which is not simply blue and red, it's something new, or the confluence of rivers. We have this river run into this river, and now you have another river that is both and, but not simply additive. It actually changes the structure of it. And so that's what we have to look for, so that we don't fall into some of the problems, say, in like the second wave of the women's movement, where so many privileged white women talked about, we need to get women in the workforce, where we knew that women of color had never had the option, not to work on the whole in this country. And so that intersectional analysis helps us see how those differences are operating and giving shape to one another in any given circumstance. And it lets us see it's not just the identities, but it's also the structures of power around the identity. Because very often current intersectional thinking gets sort of focused on identity. And so everybody can go, oh, I'm an intersectional, here are my identities. But those identities grant different access to power and shape lives in different ways. And so it's about bringing all that together to do a critical analysis of whatever phenomenon's in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to continue on, these tools, as Susan mentioned, have been around. So the lens of intersectional thinking have been around. But I always think, Tripp, that theologians were a bit slow. So we're always slow to the game. So even though an analysis has been around for a long time, we don't use it. An example would be post-colonial thinking and post-colonial analysis. It's been around, and then theologians all of a sudden about 30 years ago said, oh, why don't we use it and use it to analyze and how we think theologically. And biblical scholars actually did it before us, but we theologians are a little slow. So as Susan mentioned, this tool has been around. It took us a long time. And even Susan and I, when we're thinking about what can we co-write about, we realize that this is a big void, and it will be a great tool to think theologically and how we understand ourselves and God's presence in this world and how God interacts. So this is a wonderful tool. And, church is always a bit slower than theology too. So we're hoping that, as theologians, we use this tool as a way of thinking theologically, that the church will also follow too, and we'll be able to think intersectionally.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions was about the difference between intersectional and intercultural theology, and one of the things that comes to mind that might be a way of getting at it is to Grace, in a lot of your work around the Holy Spirit, there's simultaneously looking at the Spirit, or the phenomena that humans experience as spirit cross culturally. And in the Homebrewed Guide to the Spirit, you talk about that, and then you also are describing the experience of both being an Asian female theologian in a Presbyterian context, and all that kind of stuff. How do you differentiate theologies that are dealing with different cultures to then thinking about intersectional ones? Because I can see how someone would get easily easily see them getting confused.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And just listening to you is that I'm sure everybody is going to get confused. So just to make it more simply, I think intercultural. So I edited a book with, now I can't remember, Jan Aldridge Clanton, intercultural ministry. And we talk about intercultural studies and intercultural theology. So that in itself is just looking mainly at culture. So I have my own Asian American culture. You have your white culture. Susan has her own culture. So we're looking at culture in general terms and how, particularly myself as an Asian American feminist theologian, my Asian American culture is very rich in its own culture, religion. There's so much richness in there that can offer to the white Western heteronormative theology. So intercultural is just looking at the culture. And so when we now talk about intersectionality and intersectional theology, it includes culture, but it includes all of the other realms that are not part of the intercultural theology. So it looks at our sexuality, you know, and intercultural, sure, we can touch on it, but that really doesn't come in. We look at socioeconomic status, our ability, our gender, our orientation, our, you know, those are all, as well as culture. There's many things that intersectional thinking and intersectional theology wants to touch. And so that's why I go back to that Duke interview. And when that person was saying, you're writing about this and this and this and this, like you're all over the place. And at that time, I couldn't give the term intersectionality. But now, you know, 5-6 years later, that's what I've been doing. And it's not just me, a lot of us are doing it. Just sometimes we just don't have the words to describe what we're doing and what we need to do from here on forth.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that too, that one of the things that characterizes intersectionality is that it is always focused towards social justice. And I think that intercultural thinking is about certainly understanding, appreciating one another's cultures, being able to live together. Intersectionality is about creating new social systems, shifting the balance of power, creating this just and equitable world. And so I think that's another distinction between the two.
Thanks for adding that, Susan. So we include the cultural aspect in the intersectional thinking, but I think, the social justice part is so important because we begin by thinking about liberation theology as a whole and some of the limitations of liberation theology. So, the social justice part is so crucial when we're thinking intersectionally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And do you think that there's sometimes intercultural work can be used in a way that one culture then appropriates elements or ideas or things from another culture without recognizing the power that's play in either one? And I think one of the things about the intersectional description in chapter 1 of the book is that you don't imagine like this is some abstract, distanced analysis of things as a scholar in a tower. Intersectional analysis comes with a biases towards justice and towards transformation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's rooted in that long tradition, like I said, beginning in Black feminism, and then as it moved more into sort of the academic feminism and the last couple of decades of activist work, it really took on that shape of being much more aware of issues of sexuality, social class, religion, nation of origin, and all those sorts of things, so that we're trying to look at all of those at once, because to address issues, we've got to deal with the whole of the problems, because all those systems that are related, so sexism, racism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, on and on, support one another. And you can't dismantle one without dismantling all of them. And so I think intersectionality gives us that lens to imagine how do we dismantle the entire system of inequality.
Yeah, and just to add, you were asking about the cultural appropriation of items and thinking and so forth. I think, we always have to be careful of how we use one another's culture, etc. And but I am an Asian American, so I was actually born in Korea and raised in Canada, and now I'm here teaching in the U.S. As I think about some of the culture, particularly the East Asian culture that I've inherited, there is so much richness. When I first immigrated, and Tripp, we talked about this before, and I write about it, people made so much fun of who I am and my culture that for most of my life, I've been embarrassed that I am a Korean. I was born in Korea. And it's just recently, overcoming, and those things are all, I'm thinking about it more and more, and I'm writing about it and thinking about it, rooted in xenophobia, rooted in racism and marginalization. All those things fed into why I didn't like my culture that I was born into. But now overcoming it and embracing it, there is so much richness, not only in Asian culture, East Asian, but in all cultures. And so when we as Christian theologians and as Christians, living in this world that's becoming smaller and smaller, the world is shrinking, we wonder, do we really know who God is just from what 2,000 years of white male theologians have taught us? No, we don't. That's just a little speck. It's so tiny. And the language is so limiting. The way of thinking is just so dualistic. These days, I'm so against dualism, but it's just so dualistic. And so why don't we open up our eyes and our minds to look at how different cultures think about God and think about God's presence in the world? So the culture itself is very, very important. And understanding and not appropriating one another's culture, but appreciating and using one's own culture and bringing it in. And there's going to be a lot of mixing, a lot of hybridity that's happening. But then, when we're thinking about intersectionality, then we think, are we just going to stick with the culture? No. How do we use all the intercultural ways of thinking and ministry and being church that will lead to some justice work that needs to happen? Because as we look in this world, with the COVID-19, the outbreak, the racism against Asian Americans is enormous. There's a scholar, Russell Jung, who's tracking the number of cases, physical and verbal cases against Asian Americans. So we think, okay, there's one thing to appreciate one's culture, but then if we're not using the intersectional lens, then this type of systemic racism is going to continue and on, not just against Asian Americans. There'll be another group and another group and another group. So I think it's just so important today to think intersectionally, and how as theologians and as Christians are we going to keep thinking intersectionally.
So early in the book, you talk about developing an intersectional hermeneutic, and that you use it to then interpret at a number of different layers, say like one's own life, and you talk about the role of biographies and things, a tradition and its structures and things, and then to talk about even using it to think through your own imagination and the ways in which certain parts of your identity, certain structures and culture have kind of internalized within you. Could you kind of introduce that concept of cultivating an intersectional hermeneutic, which is something anyone can cultivate it, and the benefits of using it as scholars and as a people of faith?
Do you want to go first, Grace?
No, you can go ahead, Susan.
Just even the two of us run into a little this, like, who's talking about it? It's really sort of to be cliche and promote the book. I mean, throughout the book, we have the kind of questions that help create that kind of lens, because because that's really what it is. It's a lens for analyzing things that go on. And so you ask these questions in the moment, sort of like, how are these things interacting together? How do I see this in all its complexity? And Vivian May, who's a feminist theorist, talks about this is sort of both and. How do I hold these tensions in mind? So rather than saying this or that, it can be this and that. And she talks about simultaneity, with this recognition that all of these things are happening all at the same time, and that kind of complexity and ambiguity is okay. And so I think it's really a matter of getting ourselves to think those sorts of ways, to sort of practice that. How do I not look at this situation only as what they may call a single axis lens, where I'm just looking at gender or race or sexuality, but how do I use an intersectional lens and see all of them at the same time interacting and shaping one another? So I think it's just a matter of sort of taking in those sorts of questions, practicing it as a discipline so it becomes a natural way of critiquing the world.
Yeah, and to continue on, as a theologian, and even when I was studying, most of my writing centers on either gender justice or racial justice, those two. And I get asked, not on camera a lot, but on the side, they will say, which is worse? Is racism worse towards you, or is sexism worse towards you? So that's a common question people ask me on the side. So, that always gets me thinking, which is worse? And I know when women of color get together, I've heard discussions like this a lot. And so some would say sexism is worse than racism, and some would say, no, racism is worse than sexism. And so for me, when I reflect on what is worse, I'm thinking these isms are all working together. It's not just one thing working towards me. It's not just racism towards me. It's the racism and the sexism that is combined that works together. So I think rather than compartmentalizing all of these things, it's what Susan just talked about, both and. It's to really get away from the dualism thinking. It's not man and woman, heaven and earth, spirit and matter. It's all of these things. And Christianity, because of dualism, has just separated this. And I think that has done great disservice to how we think theologically, how we understand God, and how we live as Christians. If we can think just both and that's a very Asian way of thinking too. So, and other people around the world think that way too. But if we can think that way, think in those ways, I think it's more helpful in understanding who we are ourselves. So, as I'm not just a woman, but I'm a Korean woman. I'm also not just a Korean woman, but I'm also educated. I'm also straight. There's so many identities. So it's not just going to be one thing. It's all of these meshed together. So even at the end of the book, as I teach theology, everybody thinks it's so simple and it's all clear cut. If you're doing systematic theology, it's all little boxes and we just talk about them. But at the end of the day, and at the end of my class, at the end of the semester, I probably usually will close by saying that theology is really messy. And we say that in the book, we close it. It's not so clear cut. It's so messy. And the more you do theology and the more you think theologically, you realize how messy it is, because it's all of these things kind of together. It's who we are, our identities as Christians here in the US. I know now, Tripp, you're not here. You're in a really blissful area out in, where are you now? Edinburgh? Yeah, somewhere over there. When one day I hope to visit. But anyway, it's not so clear cut. It's this both and just we need to kind of move away from this dualism.
And I think one of the things that's hard for us in developing this kind of hermeneutic is to pay as much attention to our dominant identities as our subordinate ones, because I think we all like to sort of focus on the areas where we're oppressed, so we want to really pay attention to being a woman, being a person of color, being queer, whatever. But those experiences are shaped also by our places of privilege. And so, and I think that's part of what Grace and I do in the book when we tell our own stories, is we try to make that visible, that because I have white privilege, my experiences of sexism were very different than Grace's. I mean, yes, it was still sexism, but it was shaped by race in really significant sorts of ways. Or, we tell the stories of getting married, which gets shaped really interestingly for me being gay, and then for Grace being Korean American, and so and straight, and all those things come into play. And so it's really important to note those dominant identities and how they play in as well, so that we don't sort of distance ourselves, but that we live in that complexity and ambiguity, as Grace was saying.
Yeah. And to stay with it, it's always going to be this ambiguity and complex. But we, especially in the church, we want to make everything so simple. We just bring it on a platter or in a little box, and we want to make it so simple, clear cut, but it's not so like that. God
is not 3
infinite.
points in a poem. I mean,
yeah. We Presbyterians love a 3-point sermon.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the one of the questions that came in, and y'all started to touch on it on the way you used your own biographies in the book, but what kind of advice for, and this is from a minister, would you give for someone using in a group, using the biographies of each of the person there to help them cultivate the type of intersectional theological reflection you're describing?
Oh, okay. Well, I always say that theology is biography and biography is theology. I think we come to know who God is by coming to know who we are. If we truly are created in the image of God, you, Tripp, and Susan, and I, that's a wondrous thing. So understanding ourselves and then also accepting ourselves. There's, I think, moments in everyone's life we don't like who we are. Some days I wish I was born a white woman sometimes, or something else. But I think understanding and understanding our family of origin, or even our culture, it just opens up our eyes so much. And it just, we come to know God through our life. I think that's, I don't know how else we come to know God except for our life experiences. One of assignment I always do for an intro class is a very short 3-page theological reflection on some experience. And I said, it doesn't have to be one of those, Damascus Road or some wow experience. It can be just a simple experience. But as long as we are aware and come to understand God through the simple things, I think that is a lens, this intersectional lens that we want everyone to have in the church, and those who are just seeking, and those who are spiritual but not religious. We have to understand ourselves and our experiences. And that's why the intersectionality helps us understand. It's not just that you're a man, Tripp. You are more than that. There's all these other layers. And so we appreciate all of that, right? You are straight, you are a father, and all these, you have a PhD, all these layers, and we come. And so, I don't know, I can get carried away, and I'm probably not even coming to answer whatever the question was. So maybe Susan can just fill in more.
Yeah, I think the stories are key, because only Grace has the experience of being Grace, and only you have the experience of being Tripp. And the only access I have to those perspectives is through your story of it. And I think that means we have to have all the stories. And so I think intersectionality calls us to be sort of more humble in our theological pronouncements, because we have to recognize that we can't theologize for other people from our social location. And I think that's the mistake that straight white men for 2 centuries have made, is assuming that they could sort of universalize their pronouncements as if they had no social location themselves. And as Grace had mentioned earlier, this followed itself into other movements. I mean, early liberation theologies ignored gender. Some early feminist theologies ignored race. Everybody ignored sexuality till queer theologians came along. And so I think that we need all those stories to have all of those pieces. one of the critiques of intersectionality has been, well, if you keep doing this, you basically divide everybody into their own little unit. But I would say that's actually the strength of it, because it reminds me that it's important for me to hear everybody's stories. And again, to let those stories stand in ambiguity and in conflict and in contradiction with one another, and not feel like I have to ignore or justify the stories that don't align with my sort of view of the world. But again, it can be both my
Yeah.
story and this story that's really different.
And I think the intersectionality reminds us how if we are trying to understand God, we will never come to understand God. It is too complex. We just get to the tip of the iceberg. This little tiny earth that we're living in is just in this tiny little solar system, in this tiny little, whatever galaxy or whatever. The universe is large. So we should, as Susan said, need all the voices. We need all different voices and different experiences to help us understand and to think more theologically and more clearly. Anselm said, or I forget now who, if it was Anselm or Augustine, all the white men sound the same now to me. But anyway, they said, if you know God, then that is not God, right? I think that was Augustine. Was that Augustine, Tripp? Yeah. But anyway, yeah, we will never know, but that doesn't mean we just give up. We still seek and we want different tools to help us. And so presently, the intersectional tool is a very helpful tool for white men, for white women, for people of color, for queer. It just is understanding that it is very complex. And, we go through how even using the intersectional lens to read scripture and how we can be church. This is a tool in how we can move forward, and so that we will work towards a more just society and build a better kingdom of God.
Yeah, when I left fundamentalism, I sort of set aside one set of answers and then just went looking for another one desperately. But at some point in that journey, what I realized is the answers became much less important to me than the journey. And at some point, I decided I would rather live in ambiguity, because I realized if all of this could be known, what's the point? That's no longer fun or interesting to me, and certainly falls below the level of anything I would call the divine. And so I think moving toward embracing that ambiguity, and so not looking for the one right answer, but looking for what is the right thing to do to further us toward justice in this moment, for me, is now the quest.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I wonder how as educators and in the classroom, what have you learned about helping people with significant amounts of privilege name it and then understand what type of responsibility comes with that, and then also how to deal, especially with there were a number of questions that came in somewhat related to, I'm an upper middle class straight white guy, and I love the book, and then still I want, like, I don't want to, I feel sometimes the need to beat myself up or then like put myself down. And then it's like, I want to be an ally to people, but then I naturally just start taking things over. Like, all these type of questions. What does it look like when the, for the analysis to shape someone who, hadn't learned to think that way before or attend to those type of particularities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these days I'm teaching a lot of 100 and 200 level women, gender, and sexuality studies courses that are in our general education curriculum. So that means I get a lot of students for whom this stuff is brand new. And so, I go back to, actually my PhD was in religious education. So I go back to those concepts of start with the learners where they are, let them discover things for themselves. And so one of probably my favorite class is when I do on British murder mysteries and TV crime dramas. And we basically learn to use an intersectional lens through watching these. And the resistance level goes so far down dealing with pop culture than, say, when they're in our intro to WGSS or like an ending violence against women class. And by moving them incrementally through that and letting them see it, there through the show we're watching or in the book we're reading, kind of moves past some of those barriers that often get raised. Now, granted, there's already some self-selection, right? Because they took a class called, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So these are not the students I was dealing with in the Baptist classroom when I was teaching religion. That was a whole other thing. But I think helping them just make those steps through it by seeing it and discovering it for themselves. And then I go, oh, well, hey, we have a name for that concept. It's called sexism, or it's called intersectionality. And I found that to be really helpful. And they get really enthusiastic about it. Again, I think the young straight white guys go through that. Oh, now I'm a horrible person. What do I do? And I think guilt is counterproductive. Guilt gets us nowhere. But we also talk about that. So what do you do? How do you go out and in your sphere of influence make a difference in the world? And, there's a lot for all of us. Unlearning racism for white people, is a lifelong process. We never get to the point where we get to say, I'm not a racist. Of course we are. We live in a culture that is, but I think we can say I'm anti-racist. I'm working toward that. And we can't say I'm an ally, because that's something I think that gets bestowed on us, not something that we pronounce upon ourselves. I think that when we act as allies, then it is the people with whom we're acting who get to call us that. And we shouldn't be in it to be called allies anyway. We just do it because it's the right thing. So that was a lot of stuff. So great. Sorry.
Yeah. So no, you know what? Every time you talk, I'm just so excited when you're speaking, because you have so many good things to say. And then going back to Tripp about the power, and the privilege and etc. Actually, we deal with concepts of power in the book. So, those who hold power and privilege, I think, there's different ways of looking at power. You're holding the power, or you're giving the power away. And so I think one way for those who have privilege, and some people will say, okay, Grace, you're privileged because you have a PhD, etc. So in one ways, yes, in other ways, no. So that's how the intersectionality, it's very, very complex. It's not just one little thing. There's so many multiple layers of things. So we have to understand all these different layers. But then when, Tripp, you're saying you're a white male, a straight white male. So then I think there is this sense of privilege and understanding privilege. And in our place of privilege, we can also work to empower. So there is this giving power to those who may not have a voice. And I think, Tripp, I think you do a great job in doing this, because you have invited people of color to the Homebrewed. And not everybody does that, right? And not everybody invites women too. So you are giving a platform, and you want to empower those that have less power and less privilege. And I think that's what we need to do once we recognize. So that's why understanding ourselves and our location, and where all these, understanding the complexities of ourselves and the intersectionality that's happening in ourselves, then where then can we move forward? How can I empower those who have less power? And trying to decenter power is another thing. I think it's been centralized by white male for a long time here in the US, through slavery, genocide, indentured workers, all these bad things that happened here in American soil. So I think, we need to break down and challenge the status quo. There's so many things that can be done. And so we need people from all places to work together to kind of challenge this, challenge the white supremacy, challenge the white heteronormative ways of thinking. And so we break these down and look at it through these different lenses, so that at the end, we can have a more just society.
Yeah, one of the things that popped in my head while you were talking, Grace, and I think it's because Susan mentioned we have a mutual friend, Tim Bruck, who I had my youth ministry class when I was in undergrad with, and he would be provocative and say things like, "Well, are you running a youth group that any of your female students would think God could call them to be a minister?" And I'm like, of course. And he goes, so what's the ratio and who gets to talk first, right? And I'm like, well, I mean, I regularly say things like everyone's voice matters or what, whatever. And he's like, just record or count for a month until don't change anything and see what just happens if you think you're doing a good job in the system that's already there. And you go to one of the few churches in this rural county that has female deacons and an associate minister that's a female. So it's probably the edgiest religious space in rural North Carolina. And I kept track. And in a youth group that had 17 people in it on a consistent basis, 2/3 of which are female, 3/4 of the comments during Bible study were men.
And I think that's very common, Tripp. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that, and so after that, I started practicing things that seemed really weird to me. Hey, fellas, let's let a female talk. Or you ask someone a very specific question that you can see is paying attention. It looks like you thought of something. Is there something you have to share? Like little things, and you can make change, but it's only when you realize, because you paid enough attention, that the normal is internalized in everybody in that room. So they're just going to perform patriarchy. And you don't have to, if you change your bylaws, that doesn't do much. Other than, I guess you might not get fired if you let women talk. But, and this is, rural Baptist life. But the one of the things that comes to my mind is, for example, like the podcast, I will send 70% of the invites are not straight white guys. And almost every straight white guy I invite says yes to the podcast. And half of persons of color just don't reply. And then and if I'm not friends with them or friends with someone that knows them, then it's always more difficult. And it's gotten more difficult the bigger they know the podcast is. Right. So it was frustrating for me because I was like, my diversity ratio was better when people thought I'm talking to 1,000 people, or he didn't have his PhD yet or whatever. And so the in processing it and talking to some of people I would call my mentors and things, they said, one, you recognize it's a safer place after you've become friends with someone, so then choose who you're friends with. And the other is you can't make someone respond, but you can choose what type of practices you have, right? So you can keep the same ratio even if it doesn't, the correspondence. But anyway, that's what I was thinking of, and I thought I'd say something that seemed really, vulnerable and awkward, and then use a live stream to get advice, because it's one of those things, like, I know it really matters to me. I'm okay being uncomfortable, but I also know I should do better. But
yeah, well, I'm so glad you're sharing this, because I think in most cases it's women that are vulnerable, and we show our vulnerability, and men, even though they may be vulnerable, they never show it. So, and I think we need more white men like you, Tripp, to show your vulnerability, and so that it'll make people like us feel a little better too. As an Asian American woman, the white dominant society wants, or they stereotype us Asian women as, nice and quiet, right? So as long as I just smile and nod and stay quiet, everybody is all happy. Once I talk too much, then nobody likes me. It's like she's not fitting in the stereotype. So what's wrong with her? She's this, loudmouth Asian woman talking too much. But anyway, I think, we got to break down the stereotypes. We got to break down what our expectations are, and just show the vulnerability that whether you're man or woman, we are all vulnerable in many cases, and that we can be loud. Asian women can be loud, Black women can be loud, white women can be loud. We got to break down all these stereotyping and so forth. So I'm glad you shared that little piece. Thank you for that.
Because I think one of the characteristics of having power and privilege is you don't even have to see that you have it. You just think this is the way the world is for everybody. I was leading a faculty seminar a couple of years ago with a bunch of STEM faculty, science, technology, engineering, and math faculty. And we were talking about microaggressions, and I was giving all of these examples of microaggressions in STEM specifically. And so the white guys in the room said, does that happen here? And all the women and people of color in the room looked at them like, have you lost your mind? And then they started, adding to the list. And these white guys, bless their hearts, and these are ones who think of themselves as the good guys. They want to do what's right. They want to be, transformative. And they were just shocked that their colleagues were experiencing all of these things and they were absolutely clueless about it. But unless you make a choice to look for these things and then commit yourself to doing something about them, you don't have to see them. I mean, I could walk through the world and never have to think about race if I didn't want to. Could absolutely do that. Grace can't do that, though. It's there, especially at this moment. It is right there in her face. And so I have to make a conscious choice to say, I'm going to pay attention to what my whiteness gets me, and then I'm going to do stuff to overturn the very system that benefits me because of the color of my skin, which of course also gets shaped by all those other things as well, because walking through the world as a white woman is a different experience than walking through it as a white man, or as a white lesbian versus a straight white man. So we have to pay attention to all of that, and you're right, be vulnerable about it, because part of that is, once I see this stuff, I can't unsee it, and so I need to do something about it. And I think we have to be willing to take all of those steps.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that strikes me about why some of the stuff you do in the middle of the book is really helpful is sometimes if you begin, especially in a room where more people have unacknowledged privilege, it becomes personal and the natural thing to do. And this is anybody, right? Like if you hear something as a criticism, and then in a religious context where to have done wrong can often lead to someone feeling shame, is in the defenses go up. And the next thing you know, someone is saying things that just are contradictory to the person you knew, and it's embarrassing. And now the whole room's going to have to remember they said that the rest of the time, right? So some of the parts in the book I thought were really powerful is the way you use different biblical texts, right? Because the assumption for people of faith when they go to the text is we're going to wrestle with it, and something good and beautiful and blessing is going to come out of it. And sometimes that blessing is a challenge, but that's a good thing, right? And so what kind of advice, or is there a particular Bible story? Those were the two questions related to the Bible, where engaging Scripture becomes an asset for learning to think theologically on intersectional terms.
Okay, so that's a very good question. My mind is going a little blank. But there's so many stories in the Bible that kind of provoke us. And one of them is when the woman comes into many of these stories, they're not named. And I just find that so interesting because, okay, so for the example of the woman that comes to anoint Jesus' feet or head, we don't know, there's two stories. She's not given a name, but then Jesus says, in memory of her, everybody will know that this happened. I just find that so interesting. And we have to, we use Fiorenza, Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, to help us understand and read the text kind of with this intersectional lens. So understanding, why is this woman's name not recorded? Why are the men acting like this? And, how did she even know that she can do this? And why did Jesus even allow this to happen? There's so many questions around the story. It is a beautiful story, and we read it usually once a year. But then myself, with this kind of Asian kind of cultural lens, also because of my Asian identity, in Asia, we rarely use names. So, for example, young kids are referred to by name, but once you get a certain age, you become like, people will refer to me as so-and-so's mother. Okay, so I am the mother of 3 kids, so you're so-and-so's mother. So somehow your name gets dropped. And so, which leads to the whole question of one's identity. Who am I? Am I this person? Am I a wife? Am I a daughter-in-law? it's a very kind of unclear thing, but I see the biblical text during this where you're not given a name, and it's not just her that's not given a name. There's many other women that are not given a name. So we want to understand what is happening. Is it a cultural thing? Is this patriarchy that's happening? Why are women so made invisible? That's another theme I'm thinking about a lot these days. Why are women made invisible? So I'm just raising a lot of questions to answer your question, Tripp, but I think we cannot just read the text just as is. And Susan and I grew up both in a very conservative church. And so everything was literal for me when I was growing up. Everything was, So to move away from that and using all these different lenses to help us understand and read the text, and now this intersectional lens, I think it's only going to enrich our way of understanding and how the text comes alive to us and how it impacts us and how it will impact other people. So that's kind of what I have on the top of my head right now.
And I think, if we think about Jesus in this way, Jesus was a working class Jew living under empire. We didn't learn that in Sunday school. I mean, it was right there in front of us.
And we don't want to teach that in Sunday school,
no,
Susan.
No,
yeah,
because when we say that, there are political implications to that, because all of a sudden we see who Jesus was in solidarity with. And so I think that social justice bent can really find its place in biblical interpretation when we start to see, who were these people? To whom were they speaking? What were the situations in which they were living? And recognizing the biblical text is one that is geared toward justice as well, and really pulling that out as liberation readers have done, except now bringing this intersectional lens again. So it's not simply looking at one aspect, but it's understanding that they're all there and give us this sort of new way to read the text.
And as you do that, I think the text, there's new life to the text. And that's why, we always reread it again and again, because if the text doesn't come alive, then we don't need to read it again. But because it does, and even that story or any of the unnamed woman's story in the Old Testament or the New Testament, we have to kind of read against the grain and see what's missing, and see that it was Jesus was living under empire, and then the scriptures itself were written under empire. So the colonialism that's happening, all these things we have to keep in mind. It's not a simple text. This text that has survived thousands and thousands of years is very complex, and so we can't make it simple.
That's why the reading has to be both and, to draw from intersectionality's language. And an example I use with students is the story of Rahab and the spies who went into Jericho and all that, because there's one way to read that text where, she's a hero. She helped out God's people. There's another way to read her as a collaborator who brought about the doom of her own people. We have to ask the question, why was she in sex work and living on the edges of the city anyway? What was going on within that social system? And was it a better social system to go from one form of patriarchy to another, where now she has betrayed her people? And I think the text can bear all of those readings. Again, it's not a quest to find the one right answer, but it's to let these possibilities speak and to hold them in tension, even when they contradict one another. I think we can say, yes, it's all of these things.
Yeah, the word contradiction is very important, because we keep bringing it up in the book too. It's not as simple as our Sunday school teachers made it, that it is complex, there's contradiction, and it's messy.
One of the things that comes to mind when you said that is, and I think it was at least where I remember reading it explained most thoroughly, was in Andrew Sung Park's work on in a kind of process Korean account of sin, where he said, when you read scripture, when you see the word sinner, that was a sociological category in the New Testament, and then we let it be imputed with Billy Graham's agenda, right? And he says, like if he starts going through all the people that are labeled sinners, and then just starts asking the intersectional questions, right? Like, why was she a prostitute? And
Yeah, it's
that
not that
context.
simple.
Why
Yeah, it's not
were these
that simple.
shepherds
Yeah.
shepherds, and why were these people unclean and seen as sinner? And that so often a way of diffusing the kind of the liberative power that's already in Scripture itself comes by taking its language and then making it compliant with our dominant culture. Basically, like, let us learn a hermeneutic where you can read literature of the press from the Hebrew people in the early church so that it's compliant with neoliberal capitalist order, American imperialism, Christendom, our culture dominance, and can make us feel really good as we're citizens of a dominant culture that pillages a planet and destroys the poor. So once you learn the right meaning to the vocabulary, all of a sudden you're like, I would love for America to be made great again. And it probably begins by dosing bleach, right? Like there's this certain like maneuver that takes place. And the like I've done it in congregation settings with liberation readings, because when you read like a liberation theologian's reports from the base communities, right, reading a parable, they immediately hear it without having to come up with metaphors for agricultural life. But some reason when you read it in Los Angeles, no one hasn't experienced farming, so they're like, well, it's a metaphor. And so anyway, I do think that
I think Tripp, you're onto something. And I think, with Andrew Sung Park, he uses the Korean term Han, H-A-N. And so that, you see, the intersectionality, we want different ways and different languages. We appreciate all these different, African terms and South American, because they open up our eyes. Okay, because if we're just going to look at this white male heteronormative European perspective, it's just like this little lens. We need to open up the lens a bit more. So when Andrew Sung Park uses Han, H-A-N, he's also emphasizing, in the Bible, we emphasize so much on this vertical relationship about sin. So we sin against God and we ask God to forgive us. And, and then you sin again and we go, oh, God, forgive us. And, all the theologians are talking about this vertical sin. In Andrew Sung Park's understanding and in many of us Asian American thinking, the vertical sin against God is important, but also we want to say, let's focus on this horizontal sin that we commit against our brothers and sisters, and not only that, against all of creation. So the animals, the planet Earth, the tree, the birds in the air, all this other horizontal relationship. And so once we realize that we are sinning against each other, that is a different perspective and a different lens of, because when we focus on this vertical, we just focus on our own piety. I just go back into my room and ask God to forgive me and everything is okay. No, it's not okay when you're sinning against your brothers and sisters. We got to do something, with this coronavirus, it's all interconnected, all this intersectionality that's happening, it's affecting everything, climate, it's affecting our environment, it's affecting everything. So we have to recognize this intersectionality of all these things happening, and the understanding of sin using the different lens, that we are sinning against one another. So if, the church, right now, the one that comes to my mind is the United Methodist Church. They can't get over the fact about the full inclusion. So what are they going to do? Most likely break into two groups. There'll be two different Methodist churches. And that's a sad thing. Why are we not understanding the sin that we're committing against our brothers and sisters and against the planet? I think partly it's because of the dualistic way of thinking, but anyway.
Yeah, we could go on about bad theology all day.
I know. You can have us back on to talk about bad theology, but the bad theology is all connected to this issue too. But yeah, there's a lot of bad theology out there. But Andrew Sung Park and he has one of the books called The Other Side of Sin.
Mhm.
So looking at this horizontal relationship, the sin that we commit against one another, against queer bodies, against colored bodies and people of color, etc., etc. Yeah.
Mhm. So one of the questions came, if you could force all the long dead and gone kind of required reading of theology, right? If you were in charge of their theological purgatory, where they had to rework one of the classic Christian doctrines using intersectional analysis before fully participating in the eschatological bliss of the triune God. So, like, you're sitting there and there's like Calvin, Schleiermacher, Thomas Aquinas, and they're all there, and in comes Susan and Grace, and it says, it appears you have a small pedagogical task before fully participating in the divine life. What doctrine?
I love whoever gave this question. That's a genius question.
I'm just glad I didn't have to answer it. Like,
So they want us to pick one theologian to do this, or
a doctrine.
pick a doctrine. Oh, that's hard to do, just to pick one doctrine, because it has to be all of them. I think the
Augustine, and just say, start over. Get over yourself and start over.
Yeah, I think
especially about sexuality.
I think the whole thing needs to be redone, because you can't just do one of them, because they're all intersecting. You see, if you get sin wrong, you get the whole thing wrong, right? Or if you get God wrong, you get everything else. It's like a trickle effect. You get the whole thing. So theologian do this all over again, and every doctrine that they're working on or have worked on, because it's just all intersecting. I tell my students, 1 week we're going to do God, the next week we're going to do Jesus Christ, next week we're going to do Trinity. But I always remind them they're not separate still. They're all kind of together. I'm separating it just to make it easier for me to teach and for you to read and understand. But you can't talk about God without sin and human beings and creation and everything else. So Tripp, that theologian has to redo everything.
I think I would like for it to be like that movie Switch, where so they all have to be sent back as like queer women of color and then write their theology.
Yeah.
Using that lens and from their experience, because yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing needs to be redone. But I love the question, so thank you to whomever sent that question to you, Tripp.
So here's a question with a quote from your own book, which So Brett says, you write of a God as, quote, multiple, divergent, and contradictory. And this is on page 67. Inherent multiplicity. Can you speak more about this? In intersectional analysis, there's room for Christ the victor like Anselm and Christ as black and queer, ? I think yes, but would like you to speak about how you would use this. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that the idea of applying that notion to God comes out of that sort of both and thinking, where we don't flatten the being of God out to one thing. And so that all of these possibilities and complexities and contradictions can reside in the being of God without having to say, but there's one right one in there somewhere. And so, I think there are probably some things outside those parameters. So like the white nationalist God is not in there. That God doesn't count. And so I think anything that would be in opposition to inclusion and justice and love would not be. So it's not God without parameters, but the parameters around justice and love and peace and all those sorts of things. And within that, we let all of that stuff reside and bump off of each other. And I think if we could enjoy that, if we could rejoice, who wants a God that's so boring and simple as, some theological doctrine you can figure out? I don't want that. I want to My mind blown every time I think about God.
You don't want a syllogism?
No.
Anyway,
Uh-oh, Grace froze up.
I
on
love
us. Okay, you're good. You're
okay,
good.
thank you for that quote and that question. Okay, yeah, thank you for that quote. Just a little side note. Before the lockdown and the shutdown, I just edited Reverend Jackson's book, Keeping Hope Alive, and we're doing a PBS interview, and the PBS host was saying, "Let me read this quote from the book," and it was a really long quote, and the Reverend Jackson says, "And you say that so eloquently," and she said, "No, that's the quote from your book." But anyway, it's just when you were reading the quote, I just thought that's a really nice quote. I can't believe it's in our book. But anyway, I can't remember now what the quote was because I was trying to remember that story. But I think, when we're thinking about God, God is so big, and we again are so tiny. We can never imagine the fullness of God. We use a language like God is infinite and we are finite. I'm not a mathematician, but in my limited math head, I can't even imagine the infinite, the number infinite, whatever it is. It's hard to imagine. So yes, there are these parameters of, we can't just say, okay, that's God and anything goes. That's not how it is. It has to be centered on what we see biblically too. We see a God who's just, a God who is loving, a God who embraces all people. The lepers, Jesus loved the leper. Jesus loved the Samaritan woman. All those people that we want to cast away, with this coronavirus and the anti-Asian racism that's happening and people wanting to get rid of us. This is not the first time in history. It happened in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. It happened during the with the Japanese internment. It happened again under Trump with the Muslim ban, and most of them are from Asian or the Middle East Asian countries. These Muslims can't come. So it's nothing new. Where we want to ban people, we want to dismiss them, we want to round them up and put them somewhere in an internment camp. It has happened, and it's not just in this American soil. It happened with the Holocaust. All these things happen, and we think, okay, how do we use the intersectional lens? And we come to the scriptures too, because many people say we theologians never use Bible, but we do use Bible, and we use it for our book. So we are biblical, and I just, but we see a God who's not an anything goes God, not this nationalistic God that is so scary in our time today, that is portrayed by some nationalist white people, and it's scaring a lot of us. It's not that kind of a God. We see a God who works for justice, who wants to free the slaves in Exodus. We see all of this, and we want to use the intersectional lens and say, then who is God for us today? Yes, God can be the Black queer. God is the Asian. God, because we are all created in God's image. We can never understand the fullness of God, but we need everyone at the table. We need the queer, we need the straight, we even need you, Tripp, too. We need everybody, because everybody here at the table enriches our limited, our really finite way of understanding God, because my experience of God is different from Susan, from Tripp, and all those people who are listening to us. And so, and my life is just very short. I'm getting older, but I don't know how much longer I live. But in the fullness of our human history, I'm just a nothing. So understanding that, and I can just contribute tiny bit. So we need everybody to contribute to help us understand God and understand God's presence and what we're all called to do in our short life here on this earth. I feel like I'm preaching, but I'm not preaching.
No,
sorry.
so because when I read that section of the book, one of the dynamics I think that's helpful, or at least stuck with me, who knows if this was your intention, but is that if theology is always emerges from praxis, or emerges from the particular particular intersectional embodiment of the community, and then in a sense the theology emerges from that, and then it calls for this type of re-embodiment. So there's this ongoing dialectic between theology spoken and theology materialized. And when you recognize that, you can look back at different places in history, in the exact same language or the exact same spoken word can have life-giving effects in one context and problematic ones in another area. And I think intersectional analysis can actually help us make peace with some of the people that if we just transpose their stuff today, like a process theologian like Susan and I probably have trouble finding back-to-back sentences in the Institutes of Religion by John Calvin that we want to endorse. But that doesn't mean I can't imagine a context in which Geneva could have been blessed by parts of what was going on there, and there was a reciprocal relationship between the community that was forming in that early part of Protestantism and the theology, and it goes back and forth. It's just we don't live in Geneva, and the imposition of Geneva theology on 21st century life is problematic. And so sometimes that intersectional analysis gives us the ability to clap for the past without thinking fidelity's repetition of it. But the fidelity is that practice of embodiment, or that theology is necessary a type of praxis.
Well, that's one of the problems with fundamentalist, literalist reading of scripture, right? Is they try to act as if that text is frozen in time and that what it meant to its first readers means exactly the same thing to us today. And of course it doesn't, you know, and I get that comes out of their sort of model of inspiration and, you know, God moving the hand, it moved the pen and all that sort of stuff. That I think that's kind of a sort of magical kind of thinking that the text itself doesn't lend itself to anyway. But I think that we've got to imagine that what Paul said to the churches in Paul's time probably made a lot more sense than saying it to our churches in that same way in this time. I don't think Paul would write those same words anymore.
Yeah,
I think Paul
definitely,
would have take on things.
Yeah.
And so that's how I look at Paul, right? Is I recognize Paul was a product of that very particular time. And we're in a different time. And I think Paul would be a different person in this time and in this language and in this culture.
Yeah. And the context, you know, is very important. So we talk about context too. So when you talk about Geneva, I don't know if you've been to Geneva. Have you been to Geneva?
No, I was going to be going around Europe. That's why I moved here. But then
yeah, then this happened. You know,
now we're
I know
just on
I'm supposed to
lockdown.
be in Fiji this week, I think. But anyway, I've been to Geneva several times, and you know, and when John Calvin was around, I'm sure it was smaller, but Geneva is tiny. Like I think you could just walk around Geneva. Well, it's not, you can't walk around, but it's a very, very, very tiny little city. WCC is there, and a lot of important things are there, but it's tiny. So, and I've been into the church that Calvin preached at. I looked at his pulpit, and I've seen his tiny little chair. Geneva is tiny. So he was just speaking to this tiny little group of people, and I know it was tinier back then when he was around during the Reformation. But the problem is, you know, many of us Koreans are Presbyterian. So we just love Calvin. And when the white folks went into Korea, you know, they brought Calvinism and they brought Calvin's institutes, and we think this is it. So that is a problem, that we just think he just spoke for all time. He was just speaking for a little context, a little group of white people, white Europeans, you know. So we always, every time we're using any dead person's work or any of them, and even going back to the biblical readings and Paul's letters that Susan mentioned, we got to understand the context that they were writing and who they were writing to. And that, yeah, as Susan said, probably they wouldn't have written those things, you know, if they were alive today. And just like I write these things, the intersectional theology, I have it in front of me. I don't have all my books, but maybe 100 years from now, we probably, Susan and I, if we were living 100 years later, I don't know if we're going to be writing this thing. You know, I think, but the context today, where is it? You know, when Trump became president, the Women's March happened right after. You know, people were already planning it. And, you know, the women were all talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality was a key word. Our context is asking for it. And so I think presently today in 2020, you know, our context is thirsting for this intersectional lens. because we want to make sense of all these injustices that's happening. We want to make sense of our own experiences, our own identities. And maybe some people are actually struggling to understand their identities. I went through my life, most of my life, hating myself being born a Korean. I had nothing to do with it, but so understanding and accepting, and those are all the intersectional ways of thinking and lens. And so today in 2020, it asks for it. Maybe 500 years from now, it may not ask, and we may not be speaking for those people in 500 years. So we got to remember all these things, and even Paul's letters, it's not for all time. There are good things in there, but we got to understand the context that he was writing in.
Mhm.
So one of the questions that I think might make sense to ask here, and I'll disappear for a second to turn on our alarm. I was just texted to remind myself to turn on the alarm. I won't remember. Is what? Hold on, let me look at the question. There we go. What are the biggest questions that you think an intersectional analysis is necessary for in the life of the church? So what are the different questions or challenges the church faces that if we don't cultivate an intersectional analysis, we're just going to keep rubbing our head against the wall or scratching sandpaper?
Mhm.
Wow, that's a big question. I don't know. I can begin, Susan. I think if we don't have this intersectional lens, I think it'll lead to bad theology. So you were already mentioning about bad theology. And then that comes across in how we preach, in our Bible study groups, in our adult forum, in our Sunday school. It's going to have an effect. And also, racism is rampant in our churches. It's not in all churches, but it's certainly there. So we need an analysis of how can we become anti-racist. And certainly sexism is there. So many churches still don't ordain women or ordain different groups of people for one reason or another. There are all these isms that are preventing all of us to come to the table and rejoice in the table and be part of this loving feast that God has prepared for us. God didn't, say, okay, I don't want the Koreans here. That's 50 million South Koreans you're talking about, and about 23 North Koreans. Nobody, God doesn't say, oh, let's get rid of all the women. That's like 52% of the whole world population. And by the way, Asians are 60% of the world population. There's so many of us. How can you exclude? So I think the church, this intersectional lens, so that we can fight anti-racism, fight patriarchy, fight all these evils that are in the world. And you see it through the sermons and how we practice church, how we practice fellowship, how we just come in communion. We need this desperately. It may not be this book, but we need the lens so that we can be a more just church. Our church is not just, it's so broken. I'm generalizing, but in majority of our denominations, we're broken. We don't know what to do with queer. We don't know what to do with women. We don't know what to do with Black people and Asians and Native Americans. We just don't know what to do. So we just, want to exclude and just make this white happy church. So we need the lens.
Yeah, and in the book, we actually address ecclesiology very specifically because intersectionality does lead to some really tricky questions. So take, for example, baptism, which is a really meaningful ritual, I think, for those who go through it. And yet at the same time, it creates an in-group and an out-group. And certain practices of communion. It's the same thing, in-groups and out-groups, which of course are problematic. And so it's like, how do you affirm a Christian identity through the rituals of the church without at the same time creating an other that is somehow lesser than? So how do we hold, again, back to both and, how do we hold in mind both the validity of our own practices and rituals within the church in some sort of non-exclusionary way, and recognize that the practices of other groups are equally valid, equally as important, even when they stand in contradiction to what we're doing? And again, I think that goes back to being able to stand in that ambiguity and in the not knowing as a way to try to practice justice within a specific context. But it's tricky, you know. And so in the book, again, we introduce it and then we ask questions.
Yeah, and that's a good thing though, Susan, because every chapter we do end with questions, because this is an introductory book. So each chapter, you know, as we go through the different concepts and ideas, we end with a chapter so that we end not with we end with questions. Here are like one example. So every chapter will end with questions so that you can use it as a study guide or a church group. And people have been emailing me and letting me know that they are using it in their churches and in their small groups and even chaplaincy groups. And I'm hoping professors will use it. I know people are using it in the classroom too, but we did include the questions to help people to continue to think.
In one of the things that that strikes me about its necessity is there are a whole lot of people that are born into families that are a part of the church that choose to leave precisely because their lived experience is in no way spoken to or even fully acknowledged in the church. Right. But, you know, as long as, and this is something Grace pointed out in her early Christology work, like as long as our Christology only talks to a very specific slice of human existence, understanding of, you know, the challenge and redemption and stuff, then you can't be too surprised that imperialism basically teaches you that you should learn our narrative. Let me tell you about how the Roman road works, you know, like, and for a long time, the West exported our religious anxieties, especially the ones cultivated in a hyper-Puritan missionary context in America, all over. And now people don't necessarily want to be us anymore. And even our kids and grandkids don't really want to be us anymore. And I feel like we're sitting here and if we don't learn this type of analysis becoming a gateway to a more rich and deep account of the gospel, then we'll just get we'll just continue to speak to a smaller and smaller group of people, right? And that isn't like this is necessary for church growth. It's just necessary to let your loved ones know that their full being can be known and loved and cherished by God and you at the same time. Okay, so one of the go ahead.
Go ahead, Patrick.
Oh no, this is a fun question. Someone said each of you should ask the other one a question about something that's not in the book, but y'all have enjoyed hearing the other one talk about it.
Oh,
you know,
I don't know if I have a question for Susan.
think a little bit.
Or Susan, you can just talk about your gender studies. I'm always interested in the gender studies.
No, it's not so much a question as a comment, and then Grace can respond to it, because one of the things Grace did for me early on when we first met was introducing me to this concept that was in her book, but then we talked about it of Han, because I was part of a generation of women who did doctoral work at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary during the fundamentalist takeover of the seminary. And if you talk to us today, that moment is still living and raw. Even though many of us have moved into retirement, we've all had incredibly successful careers elsewhere, but that moment evokes something. And Grace gave me the word for it. It is Han, because there's nothing I can find in the English language that captures what it is that this group of women experience. And so it is this burden that we carry because of unresolved injustice. And so I appreciated that from Grace. And I think that's a really important concept. And so I wanted to thank you for that. And so I don't know,
well, thank you. I still remember that conversation that we had when we first met when I was at Oregon State. So I do remember that. And it's, you know, it's a Korean term, but every time I share it with people, whether it's white people or Black people or Latinx, everybody is very thankful, because in some cultures we don't have these terms, but you know, every language is limiting itself anyway. So I think Han just gives us this new kind of way of articulating the unjust suffering that individuals or groups of people or even a whole country can experience. So I'm just glad that, and you sharing that, Susan, just affirms how we need to kind of dialogue with one another. I learned so much from everybody, from different walks of life. There's just so much richness and so much to learn. We just don't have enough time, and so thank you, Susan. And it's, I shared this story many times when I talk. When I was in my PhD program, my supervisor, Dr. Wells, co-wrote a book with his wife. And I said, I'm just this naive little, youngster in the 20s. I said, oh my gosh, that's so exciting. I said, oh, I would love to co-write a book. And then he said, well, Grace, he said, we are just lucky to be still married to each other. Because there's just so much going on when you write. I've heard horror stories where people are arguing over a semicolon for months, over a semicolon to be put in a book. So people argue about everything. And so, that story was always in the back of my mind. I said, I'm never going to write a book together with anybody. And I've written books with several people and edited, but with Susan, it just worked so well together because she fills in the blind spot, because we all have blind spots. So she fills in the blind spots for me and enriches how we can do theology. And I think because it's intersectional theology, I think it would have been really hard to write it by yourself, either Susan herself or me myself, because we need the intersectionality happening as you write it. Mm-hmm. So, I'm still very happy with their book. Sometimes you write a book and you go, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed about what I wrote. Or an article you wrote, I go, oh, how did I? And it's in the library system. Oh, you get so embarrassed. But this book, I'm actually very proud. And it was such a joy to write it with Susan. So I don't have a question for Susan. It's been a joy. And I know not everybody has a joyous experience co-writing, and people become enemies and they never want to see each other again. It might be a friendship divorce or a scholarly divorce. But anyway, Susan and I are so happy that we're going to do some more co-work together.
Yep. Yeah. We'll
have a Tripp. You can have us on again later on.
Yeah. I don't mind talking to both of you at the same time or separate. It all worked out. I had to cut 45 minutes of Susan and I's interview out, and it was still 2 hours.
I can't believe that, because that originally was supposed to be this talk, and I couldn't do it. And this time around I had another thing to do, and I said, this time I can't not miss the second chance to talk to both of you. But I can't believe you guys talked for that long. Wow, that is amazing.
It's probably good Tripp and I did that first so we could get all of our, do you know so-and-so, and do you remember,
okay.
Oh my God, that happened to me too, out of the way, so that we could talk about the book.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, everyone that has like friendly fire damage they carry in life because they were born Southern Baptist especially if you like have that battle scars and you're a process theologian. Then I felt like we were an endangered species that finally connected. So I know I was like, why didn't we get quarantined together, Susan? I really feel like it had taken at least 2 weeks before we got bored of each other.
Oh, at least.
I think you guys thank me for putting you guys together like that, because I was stuck in New York and I couldn't. So I'm so glad you have this lovely bond together now.
It was one of those
you can thank me later.
The friend asked 2 people to get together, and then they don't show up because they don't want to tell them it's a date. And it was like a theological setup.
Yeah, it wasn't intentional. It's just I had another event and it was a mess. But anyway, I'm glad it all worked out. Everything, at the end, I always feel things kind of work out usually. 99% of the time. My laptop crashed, so I'm hoping that I said to myself, my book that I was working on that I lost 4 months of, it's going to be better than what I had. I keep telling myself, I don't know. But anyway.
Just trust yourself.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't want to tell yourself a different story. It'll feel worse. I've noticed the second time you have to write something when it's disappeared, you're not as worried about the footnotes for making sure everyone know you read a lot. You're like, no, I did read a lot. I've already even wrote this. I'm just letting it fly. If it's a quote, I'll make sure I get it. The you know what's fascinating when you brought up the Hahn, the Southern Baptist experience of Hahn. I did a paper on Hahn in my when I was doing my MDiv, and had a very similar conversation with Frank Tupper about it, where he had said that when he first read, I think it was Andrew Sung Park's work was the first, but that concept really helped explain, and then he had recommended it to other, former students and stuff, because, and you can usually tell because even if you understand everything that happened in that whole debacle, if you weren't a part of it, the story is a real different story to tell than if you were.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And all right, so there are two. I'm narrowing down the fun questions to two of them because
Okay.
we didn't even finish
Then
all
the
the
last two
serious ones.
questions?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. We didn't even get through all the serious ones. There's some very good ones, but
You just have to have us back again.
that's perfectly fine. All right, so one of them is, so there's been a meme running around about your quarantine house. So if you two had to pick 4 other people to be in a quarantine house with the two of you, you can't pick like your family. That's not entertaining.
You know what, Tripp?
And you're probably tired of them now.
You know what I think now? We need social distancing from our kids. I got all 3 of them. We need social distancing with family. But anyway, okay, who do we want?
Yeah, you get to invite 4 people. So total with you.
That's so hard. Susan, you pick 2 and I'll pick 2. I don't know.
Okay. I think if I could bring their guitars, I'd pick the Indigo Girls because they're interesting to talk to, and they could entertain us and make us feel like we were doing social justice work.
That's a high quality pick.
This is probably a weird person to pick, but I would like to pick the Pope. I want the Pope with me in the house because I have got a million.
He's quarantined with us.
Because I got a million questions to ask the Pope. So I want the Pope.
Papa Francis. No, you get one more, Grace. Because
unless
you want both popes that are currently alive.
No. Just Francis is I only want Pope Francis. And another person. Oh, this is hard. They have to be alive?
Oh, you can pick whoever you want.
Oh, okay. Then my grandmother. Yeah, because we immigrated when I was 5, so I never really got to get to know my grandmother. So I think all grandchildren love, your parents are there to discipline you, but your grandparents are there to love you, right? No matter what. So I always missed out on that a lot. So I would love to have my grandmother.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the last question is: you're getting stuck on a deserted island for 2 years. You get 3 books. And the question is, what 3 books are you going to pick, and what book are you going to write while you're on the island with those 3 books?
Oh boy. So we each get 3 books?
Yep.
Oh.
Are we on an island together writing a book together?
Y'all can write separate books or write together. Look.
No, okay, Susan and I will
co-write a book. It was an Instagram message.
No, Susan and I will co-write a book together. Yeah, so we'll do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, on intersectionality plus others. We'll do that. But then to bring 3, wow.
Well, if we were going to write about intersectionality, I'd definitely bring Vivian May's book with us because we use that a lot in our book. And I think
I memorized it, Susan.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, we'll bring her book. We'll bring her book.
What else would we bring? Well, we probably should bring the Bible, right? Because we might need to look.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, because I didn't memorize
Good
it either.
decision.
So
I haven't memorized all of it yet.
yeah, so yeah.
I'm only at
What
30%.
I memorized.
And then one more, I don't know.
That's really hard.
Mhm.
What else we'd bring? Goodness, there's so much good stuff out there.
See,
Yeah.
when I responded, I went with those really big collected works of,
Okay.
you know,
Oh.
and I thought, if I'm going to be stuck on an island for 2 years and I'm supposed to come off with a book, then I need to pick it. This is totally kind of joking about how postmodern theory works, but this is nonetheless, it probably would work. You see, you have to pick like complete works of some poet or someone like that who is hip but doesn't have a whole lot published on them, so you don't need the secondary literature to write about. Then you pick like some hip philosopher, their big book, and it could be any of them, right? Like you pick, but it needs to be something old. So like it needs to be at least 19th century or older. You could pick a medieval mystic. You could pick a phenomenology of spirit, something like that. You pick your like, this is a classic theorist or classic scholar. And then you pick like weird French continental theorists that wrote some like 90-page book that's only in French or something, and it's super complicated and no one knows exactly what it means, but there's 4 or 5 terms in it that you think with long enough time you could convince people you understood. And then you say to yourself, I'm just reading this poet and I'm reading this classic work. How do I connect the 5 weird ideas between the two? You write it all out. And then when they pick you up, you just like look super disheveled. You don't talk to a ball or anything. Like you don't want to go like Tom Hanks on them or anything. And they come back and you're like, I figured it out. And they're like, what? And you're like, you just have to see the text. And then they're like, I mean, he's connecting some weird poet and a classic text and some really hip theorist. Like, this is high quality material. And that was my. You could
Well,
substitute any
I
of
think we
those.
can bring it. I think we can take Susan's textbook, because that's a big, thick textbook that has a lot of gender studies in it. So we'll probably need that one to write our next book. So we'll bring Susan's. But what's the name of that book?
Women, Gendered Voices, Feminist Visions.
Yeah, we'll bring that one.
I would bring the collected work of Flannery O'Connor, because that will give us many things to think about and theologize on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so we got our books and we'll be writing away for 2 years.
There you go. The I played a game where I told people to draw out of a hat at a Homebrewed event. One of them had all theorists. One of them all had some monk, medieval mystic of some sorts, and then they had like some weird phrase that was from some postmodern something or another, and then you taped it on a collection of pictures that were like famous religious art. And then so you would have like Nietzschean analysis of perpetual deferral in the works of Flannery O'Connor, and that's like on a picture of Rembrandt's like this Hebrew Lord. And we did it, and then we would you had to give a review of the book as if you had read it with a straight face. And it was that's what happens when you have too much time in a joint philosophy and religion PhD program, and you grew up as a theater major and think improv's fun. You're like, how could we combine these two?
Wonderful.
Yeah. Wonderful is one word for it. The other is could have had less student loans if I'd not spent so much time doing that. But yeah, so thank you both so much for hanging out, and I really appreciate the book, and but getting to know Susan and getting to keep Grace as a friend. So this has been a blast. Any final thoughts or places you want to make sure people check out or send them to?
Well, this is the cover of the book. I really didn't like it, but it's growing on me. So
Oh,
I know
you're not one
Susan
to-
loved it from the beginning. I was like, what? That's nothing like what I envisioned. Anyway, it's growing on me. So if you're interested, this is a book, and we would love to hear from you. I always love to hear from readers and students and people in the church, how they've understood it or how it has helped them. So it's always good to hear. And Susan and I are on both social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So we would like to hear from you from all over there. And thanks again, Tripp, for having me. It's always so fun to talk to you, so hope to talk to you more.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not optimistic that we're going to actually have AAR, or I would say I'll see you in November.
Yeah, I actually don't think we're going to have it. They AR themselves are very optimistic, but I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah. It's too big of a group, to have.
Yeah. 10,000 people.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. All in these tight quarters in Boston. I don't think so.
If they had
But
said
we'll
elbow
see.
patches keeps the virus away, we've been safe.
So anyway, well, we may see each other somewhere. I may see you there,
That would be
wherever you
wonderful.
are. Yeah.
Awesome. It was good to see both.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you.
for joining us. Always so fun to talk with Sue.